The first time I caught her measuring my pasture with a tape measure, I thought she was just crazy. By the third time, I realized she was dangerous. I'm Zeke Granger, and I own 7 acres of farmland that's been in my family since my grandfather built the barn with his bare hands. It's not commercial, but I keep goats, a few chickens, and a retired horse named Hank. It's peace and dirt and sweat. I like it that way. But then the High Pines Homeowners Association got a new president. Her name's Patricia Whitmore, a bleach blonde menace with a clipboard and a condescending tone. She looks like she's never touched a shovel in her life, but somehow thinks she knows everything about land use. I'm not even part of the HOA, that's the kicker. My land borders the development, but it's zoned agricultural and has been since the Eisenhower administration. They tried to rope me in 10 years ago when the neighborhood expanded, but I showed them the zoning code and sent them packing, until Patricia moved in. She showed up on my porch one Saturday morning while I was fixing a busted fence post. "Zeke," she said, stepping around the mud in heels, "the HOA board has voted unanimously to designate your field as a shared green space for the community." I blinked. "You voted?" "To take my land." She gave me this fake smile like I was a child who didn't understand ice cream flavors. "It's for the children, Zeke. Your field is just sitting there. We've drawn up plans for walking trails, a small dog park, and a meditation circle." I stared at her. "You don't have the authority to do that." Her smile tightened. "Once the town sees the proposal, they'll agree it's the best use of the space. It's underutilized. You'll still own it, technically. But it'll be open to the public." She handed me a brightly colored pamphlet showing cartoon kids flying kites over where my goat shed currently stands. I didn't take it. 3 days later, a "community park coming soon" sign showed up on the edge of my property. I tore it down. 5 more appeared the next day. I called the sheriff, who told me it was a civil matter unless they physically trespassed. So I installed cameras. Then I caught Patricia and 2 of her HOA cronies, Marlene and Janet, walking a group of toddlers through my pasture like it was already a city park. "Ma'am," I said, walking up, "this is private property." Patricia didn't even flinch. "It's community property under review, Zeke. You should be proud. We've already put you in our monthly newsletter as a generous donor." "I didn't donate anything," I said, stepping between her and the goats. "Then you're welcome to file a complaint with the board," she said, guiding the kids toward the chicken coop. That night I called my lawyer. The next morning I went to the hardware store. By the end of the week there was a 10-foot fence around my entire property, chain link, barbed top, and a brand new wooden sign at the gate. "Granger Farm Experience, entry $5, children under 5 free." If they wanted a park so badly, I'd give them one, but they were gonna pay. And I wasn't done yet. The first weekend after the fence went up, I opened the gate at sunrise and set up a folding table just inside. I'd built a crude sign out of pallet wood and spray paint that said tickets. I brought out a cash box, printed off a stack of waivers I'd found online, and put Hank in a fresh halter so he'd look photogenic for the kids. By 8 a.m., a line of SUVs was already forming along the gravel shoulder. I wasn't shocked. Word spreads fast when you turn entitlement into a revenue stream. The first family that walked up, 2 parents, 3 kids, all wearing matching shirts that said High Pines Family Day, handed me $25 and a bag of baby carrots. They didn't ask questions. The kids ran straight for the goats like it was Disneyland. 10 more families followed before noon. Some asked about the sudden change. I gave the same answer every time. New ordinance. Agricultural land offering public access must operate under a paid liability waiver system. Blame the HOA. That shut them up. By the end of the day, I'd made nearly $400 and had only one incident: some kid tried to ride Hank. Hank didn't move an inch, just stared at the boy like he couldn't believe the audacity. His mother apologized and handed me another $5. I thought that might cool Patricia off. If she saw money changing hands, she'd either back off or try to co-opt it. She did neither. On Monday morning, I found two uniformed city code enforcers standing at my gate. One of them held a clipboard. The other had a camera slung around his neck. "You Zeke Granger?" the tall one asked, last I checked. "We've had reports of unauthorized commercial activity on agricultural land." I crossed my arms. "From who?" "Anonymous tip," he said, flipping a page. "You installing a petting zoo out here?" "Nope, it's a farm. People pay to experience it. They sign a waiver. No structural changes, no permanent fixtures, and I'm not selling food or merchandise." The shorter one started snapping photos of the property while the taller one scribbled notes. "You'll need to file a temporary use permit if you're accepting money," I nodded slowly. "And if I don't, you'll be fined. Daily." After they left, I drove straight to the county clerk's office and requested every zoning document on file for my parcel. I spent the next 3 days reading through them at night with a highlighter, circling every clause and exemption that might help. That's when I found it. Buried in a land use amendment from 1988 was a provision that allowed seasonal educational experiences on agriculturally zoned land, including animal husbandry demonstrations and crop education tours, provided they were under 200 attendees per day and didn't involve permanent signage. I marched back into the planning office with the document flagged and ready. The clerk barely looked up. "You're good. No permit needed if it's educational." I returned home and painted a new sign. Granger Agricultural Learning Center. Over the next week, I added laminated fact sheets to every fence post. Goat digestion 101. Chicken pecking order explained. I even printed out a poster titled "How Not to Get Kicked by a Horse" and stapled it to the side of the barn. Patricia finally snapped on Friday. I was sitting by the gate sipping lemonade when she pulled up in a white crossover and stormed out with a folder in hand. "This has gone far enough," she said, slapping the folder onto the table. "You're breaking multiple ordinances and violating community decency standards." I flipped open the folder. It was full of blurry photos, kids near the chickens, a woman petting one of the goats, a man in cargo shorts standing too close to the compost pile. "These are your violations," she jabbed her finger at a photo. "That child is holding a rake, that's a liability. His dad asked if he could help clean the pen. I gave him gloves. You're not qualified to supervise children." "I'm CPR certified," I said, "and I've got waivers." "You signed one last week, remember?" Her mouth fell open. "I have security footage," I added. "You came in with that yoga group from Oakview. You were the one who tried to feed Hank a granola bar." She ignored that and pulled out a glossy map. "The HOA has submitted a formal proposal to annex your property into the High Pines jurisdiction." I stood up slowly. "You what?" "We've petitioned the county. If approved, your land falls under our governance. That includes rules about structures, noise, and public gatherings." I stared at her like she just told me she was the Queen of England. "You're really trying to steal my land." "It's not stealing if it benefits the community," she snapped. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer right in front of her. He answered on the second ring. "Tell me you're calling with good news." She just admitted they're trying to annex my land into HOA jurisdiction. There was a pause. "Get that in writing." "Or recorded." I turned the phone so the speaker faced her. "You want to repeat that?" Her face went pale. You can't record me without consent in this state?" I asked. "Only one party consent, and I'm the party." She turned and stormed off, throwing the folder into the dirt. It didn't end there. The next day, I got a letter from the county development office. It was a summons to a public hearing. The HOA had officially filed a request to rezone my land for community recreational use. I showed up to that hearing in a flannel shirt and work jeans, carrying a binder of documentation, property maps, the original zoning codes, video stills of Patricia trespassing, and a notarized letter from my grandfather's estate lawyer confirming the land's protected status under a legacy clause. Patricia showed up with a slideshow. She had graphics, charts, a digital mock-up of the proposed park complete with fake trees and a gazebo. She even brought in a landscape architect to explain how the natural serenity of my pasture would serve as a spiritual balm for the HOA's mental wellness initiative. When it was my turn to speak, I walked to the podium, opened my binder, and pulled out a flash drive. "Can you play this?" I asked the county clerk. He plugged it in. The screen lit up with footage from my security camera. It showed Patricia and her friends climbing over my fence, walking across my pasture in broad daylight and placing signs with metal stakes. Then came the audio. Her voice clear as day. "No one will stop us. Once the county sees what we've planned, this'll be ours." The room went silent. The commissioner leaned forward. "Miss Whitmore, were you aware this land was privately owned and zoned for agricultural use?" She adjusted in her seat. "We were under the impression the owner had consented in principle. That's what our community vote established." "I never consented," I said, "and a community vote doesn't override property law." The commissioner nodded. "We'll be reviewing this further." The vote failed, unanimously. 2 days later, I received an envelope on my porch. Inside was a typed letter from the HOA board formally stating that Patricia had resigned from her position due to personal reasons. I pinned it next to the chicken coop. And I added a new laminated sheet: "How to recognize a bad egg in your neighborhood." Attendance doubled the following weekend. The week after Patricia's resignation, things in High Pines didn't settle down, they curdled. Sure, the zoning board had shot down the rezoning attempt, and the HOA had tucked its tail on the annexation stunt. But the fallout from Patricia's little crusade was far from over. Turns out, when you try to illegally convert someone's land into a public park, people start asking questions, especially when security footage gets aired in a public hearing. Questions like, where did the HOA get the funds to hire a landscape architect? Or, who approved spending thousands of dollars on signage and promotional materials for a park that didn't legally exist? And most importantly, why had the HOA been charging special assessment fees to residents for community improvement projects that were never disclosed? That last one. That's what blew the whole thing open. It started with Gary Halbrook, a retired accountant who'd lived in High Pines since the first model home went up. He showed up at my farm one morning just as I was restacking hay bales. He was holding a manila folder, and he looked furious in a way only old men with time and a spreadsheet can manage. "You got a minute?" he asked. I nodded and leaned on the fence post. He opened the folder and pulled out a stack of financial statements. "I've been reviewing the HOA's quarterly disclosures for the past 4 years. There are line items here that don't match up with any approved projects. Vague stuff. Recreational Development Fund, Community Integration Initiative, there's nearly $70,000 in expenditures with no corresponding receipts." I whistled low. "That's more than vague, that's embezzlement." He tapped one of the statements. "It gets worse. They were pulling funds from the HOA's emergency maintenance reserve to pay a private contractor, someone named Blaine Whitmore. Patricia's cousin, landscaper out of state." "You're kidding." Gary shook his head. I called his listed number. Disconnected. No business license listed anywhere. But they paid him $22,000 last spring for planning and consulting services. "Let me guess," I said. "For a park that never existed." He nodded grimly. "I already submitted a complaint to the county auditor, but I figured you'd want to know." I did. That afternoon, I called my lawyer again. Not for defense this time, this was an offensive play. He advised I file a formal report with the district attorney's office, since the HOA's funds were collected under a binding charter, and Patricia had signed off on every transaction as an elected official of a private governing body. Translation: this wasn't just shady. It was criminal fraud. The DA's office didn't need convincing. Within 72 hours, they'd launched an investigation. A week later, the sheriff's department served warrants to the High Pines HOA office, which turned out to be a converted storage room inside the clubhouse, and confiscated 3 computers, a filing cabinet, and a safe that took 2 deputies and a crowbar to open. Inside the safe were Patricia's handwritten meeting notes, a thumb drive labeled Master Plan, and a checkbook with more than a dozen uncashed checks made out to the same fake contractor. The story made the local paper. Front page. HOA president under criminal investigation for misappropriation of community funds. They quoted me in the article, too, right under a photo of Hank chewing on a bucket handle. That's when the residents of High Pines really turned. At first, most of them had been too polite or too intimidated to speak up. But now that the news was out, people started showing up at my gate in droves, not for a farm tour, not for the goats. They came to apologize. One woman, tears in her eyes, handed me a pie and said she felt ashamed for following Patricia's lead during the newsletter campaign. A father of 3 admitted he'd voted for the green space proposal without even realizing it meant using my land. A group of teenage boys offered to repaint my barn for free. I turned most of them down. I didn't need apologies. I needed them to show up at the next HOA election. Gary Halbrook stepped up to run for board president. He wasn't flashy, but he was honest and thorough, and he didn't take bribes or bake fake community wellness initiatives into the budget. He asked if I'd speak at the HOA's emergency town hall meeting. I agreed on one condition: it had to be held at the farm. They brought lawn chairs and sat in a semi-circle in front of the goat pen. Someone brought a projector and aimed it at the barn door. Gary opened the meeting with a detailed presentation, going line by line through the financial mismanagement. He showed how funds earmarked for sidewalk repairs had been redirected to pay a consulting firm that didn't exist. He even found a payment made to a design consultant who turned out to be Patricia's yoga instructor. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't rant. I didn't gloat. I just laid out the facts. I didn't pick this fight, I said. I was here before the HOA existed. I didn't ask to be part of your green space or your community initiative or your park. I asked to be left alone, and when someone tried to take what wasn't theirs, I put up a fence. That's not aggression, that's protection. I looked across the crowd, most of them nodded, a few looked down embarrassed. Let this be a reminder, I continued. Power in the wrong hands doesn't just ruin trust, it destroys communities. You all deserve better. Hold your board accountable. Ask questions. Follow the money. There was a pause, a quiet moment where I could feel the weight of the last few months settling over everyone. Then someone started clapping. It spread quickly, awkward at first, then full-throated. Not for me. For the idea that maybe, just maybe, they could take back control of their neighborhood. 2 weeks later, the sheriff's office filed formal charges against Patricia Whitmore. Wire fraud, conspiracy to defraud a homeowners association, and unlawful use of community funds. Her bail was set high enough that she skipped her court date and disappeared. Rumor was she fled to Arizona. Nobody missed her. Gary won the election in a landslide. The new board voted to repeal the special assessment fees and open the books for public viewing. Transparency measures were adopted. Every expense now had to be posted online and approved in advance. The HOA even issued a formal apology to me in writing signed by all 5 new board members. I laminated it and tacked it inside the barn, next to the bad egg sign. And as for the Granger Agricultural Learning Center, it stayed open. I built a small pavilion with benches and hosted weekend classes for local schools. I taught kids how to plant seeds, how to tell the difference between goat breeds, and how to respect boundaries, physical and otherwise. I never charged $5 again. Donations only. The farm wasn't just a line on a map anymore. It was a reminder that land doesn't make a community, people do. And sometimes, all it takes to protect what's yours is a fence, a camera, and the willingness to say no loud enough that it echoes. The first sign of real closure came not from a courtroom or council meeting, but from the local high school's agricultural science teacher, Miss Laramie. She showed up at the farm one morning with a clipboard and a bundle of saplings in the bed of her truck. "Field trip program's been running on fumes," she said, hopping out. District cut our travel budget again. I figured if the kids can't go to the mountains, maybe they can come here. I guided her around the property, pointing out where we could set up shaded areas and how to keep the students out of the feed shed. She nodded thoughtfully, made a few notes, and then looked toward the east side pasture. You ever think about expanding the learning center? She asked. Not just for kids, workshops maybe, soil health, sustainable feed, that kind of thing. I hadn't, but the idea sat right. While I'd spent the last few months fending off a hostile takeover disguised as community improvement, I hadn't really considered what the farm could become beyond a bulwark. For most of my life, it had been about keeping things running, fixing what broke, and maintaining what my family built. But now people wanted to learn from it. That meant something. I told her I'd think about it. She left me with a stack of interest forms signed by over 30 students. That same afternoon, a deputy cruiser rolled up to the gate. This time, there was no clipboard or veiled threats. Deputy Morales stepped out, adjusting his belt and looking like he'd been waiting for this visit. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. I led him toward the shade near the chicken coop, offered him a cold bottle of tea, and waited. "We've got a development," he said. "Thought you'd want to hear it from us first." I leaned against a post, watching one of the hens scratch at a patch of gravel. Patricia's been located, picked up outside Tucson. She was using an alias Martha Whitman, claimed she was a freelance wellness consultant. I raised an eyebrow. "Wellness?" He pulled a folded paper from his back pocket and flattened it on the table. "Arrest report. Charges included not only fraud and misuse of HOA funds, but also falsifying tax documents, obstruction of a financial investigation, and wire fraud across state lines." She was funneling money through a fake nonprofit, Morales said. Something called Green Hearts for Suburban Renewal. IRS flagged it after she filed for tax exemption and used a High Pines address as the headquarters. I shook my head slowly. "Let me guess." The HOA never authorized any of it. "Not a single board vote on record," he confirmed. "Her cousin Blaine doesn't exist. We traced the payments she was routing them to prepaid debit accounts. Money's gone, but the paper trail's solid." "She's looking at serious federal time." I didn't feel vindicated, just tired, like a long fuse had finally burned down and now the explosion was someone else's problem. "She say anything?" I asked. He took a long drink from his tea. "Only that the community owed her gratitude for the vision she tried to bring." I let out a dry laugh and looked out across the pasture. The goats had gathered in a lazy huddle near the fence, blinking in the sun like none of this had ever happened. "What's going to happen to the HOA?" I asked. "New leadership's cooperating," Morales said. "Gary's been a rock. We're not pursuing charges against the board. They were misled, and he's already implemented oversight reforms. County's keeping an eye on it, though." He stood and dusted off his pants. "You coming to the town forum next week?" "They're honoring local contributors. Your name's on the list." I hadn't heard that. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I sat out by the barn with Hank. I brushed his coat and listened to the crickets rising in the grass. The moon was just a sliver, but the stars were sharp. When I closed my eyes, I could hear the faint echoes of laughter from last weekend's visitors, the kind that lingered and warmed the air like wood smoke. A week later, I did go to the forum. It was held at the community center, the same place Patricia had once used to host her HOA meetings. This time, there were no banners, no glossy flyers, no smug introductions. Just folding chairs, some coffee and cookies, and a podium with a modest microphone. Gary was already there when I arrived. He was talking to a group of residents near the back, older couples, young families, even a few teenagers. When he saw me, he excused himself and walked over. "She's being extradited next week," he said quietly. "Federal holding until trial. Could be a year before sentencing." "Let me guess," I said. "She's not planning to plead out." He shook his head. "Her lawyer's already making noise about mental exhaustion and community misunderstanding, but the evidence is airtight." I nodded and scanned the room. People were relaxed, talking quietly. No tension in the air, no whispering behind clipboards. Gary stepped up to the mic and cleared his throat. Thanks for coming tonight. We've got a short agenda, but before we begin, I want to recognize someone who reminded us all what it means to stand up for what's right. I shifted in my seat. Zeke Granger, would you come up? There was a polite round of applause. I hesitated, then stood and walked to the front. Gary handed me a small plaque, nothing fancy. Just my name, the words Community Integrity Award, and the date. I didn't give a speech. Just nodded once and stepped back down. After the meeting, a man I hadn't seen before approached me in the parking lot. Tall, clean-shaven, wore boots like someone who hadn't just bought them for show. You Zeke? He asked. Depends who's asking. He offered a hand. Name's Wyatt Harlan. I'm putting together a regional farming co-op, educational outreach, shared equipment, supply negotiations. We're trying to get a few anchor locations started around the county. Heard what you've got going here. Thought maybe we could talk. I agreed to meet him that weekend. We shook hands and he left with a nod. The following Saturday, Wyatt and I walked the property. He asked smart questions: how often I rotated the pasture, what kind of feed I used, whether I'd consider letting other smallholders run classes or demos here. It was the first time in a long while someone had asked about the farm without trying to take it. We walked the perimeter, past the far fence line where the trees started to thicken. I hadn't cleared that stretch in years. He looked at the space thoughtfully. You ever think about building a small greenhouse back here? He asked. Could do year-round programming. Maybe even supply a few local schools. I looked at the overgrown brush, the old fence posts leaning like tired soldiers. Then I looked back at the barn, the goats, the chicken coop, the laminated signs fading in the sun. Yeah, I said. I might. 2 months later, the Granger Agricultural Learning Center became the first officially recognized educational partner in the regional co-op. We installed a 20-foot greenhouse, added a composting station, and built a shaded enclosure with benches for outdoor workshops. Local teachers started rotating classroom visits, and a nearby college even sent interns to help with seasonal projects. No one tried to rename it. No one asked for a vote. And not a single person brought a flyer with cartoon children flying kites. The HOA settled into its new role quietly. They fixed the sidewalks, repaired some drainage issues, and hosted monthly potlucks that didn't involve any secret agendas. Gary kept the books clean and the meetings short. No one ran unopposed anymore, and the land. It stayed what it had always been, not a park, not a battleground. Just soil, sun, and space to grow. Let the kids plant seeds. Let the goats teach patience. Let the community remember what happens when you try to take what isn't yours, and let the fence stand not as a barrier but as a reminder. Respect is earned, so is land, and I've got both.